Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Jackson and this is my Ranch Digital project. A newspaper publication called the Yorkville Inquirer published an article titled The Texas Fence Troubles. This article was published January 17, 1884, and it addresses the conflict between open field grazing and barbed wire. It concludes by reporting that new legislation has been passed making fence cutting a crime. Not only that, but killing fence cutters would henceforth be an act of justifiable homicide. This article gives the reader an idea of how serious the issue of barbed wire actually was. It was an incredibly divisive issue, one in which drastic legislation was written up to combat against the aggressive measures people were taking against the wiring. The idea that simply cutting a fence is an act worthy of justifiable homicide is evidence to how grave the act was seen as. The article somewhat addresses the larger question that my research has been covering, that question being, how did barbed wire impact the cattle industry? For this presentation, I will be covering a person important to my research, and that is the man who invented barbed wire, and then I will cover the importance of the invention for the cattle industry as a whole. So to give a bit of background on why barbed wire was invented, the wire solved many major fencing issues which plagued landowners at the time. One of those issues was wandering cattle. See, wood was scarce and expensive in the great American desert, and thus expensive to use for fencing. Farmers tried to growing thornbush hedges, but these were completely ineffective, and smooth wire hardly worked on cattle either. Finding both of these solutions inadequate, landowners sought new ideas and new technology, and from those ideas spawned the technology of barbed wire. The modern design of barbed wire was invented in 1874 by Joseph Glidden. His design may not have been the first, as the original patent was issued to Lucien B. Smith in 1867. Glidden's design was certainly the best. A simple Google search titles him the inventor of modern barbed wire, meaning his design was the one that influenced the industry the most. After Glidden's design became popular, by 1876, his company was making almost 3 million pounds of barbed wire annually. This just shows how important to landowners of the time considered his invention. So, who was Joseph Glidden? Glidden was born in Charlestown, New Hampshire, but would move to DeKalb, Illinois in 1843, where he and his family would purchase a farm, and where he would eventually establish his wire manufacturing business. He performed a variety of jobs and important roles within his community for the majority of his stay within DeKalb. From 1852 to 1854, he served as a sheriff for the county. Many years he served on the county's board of supervisors. In 1876, he was the Democratic nominee for Illinois State Senator. From 1861 to 1874, he served as a member of the board of school directors, and for 20 years paid the largest school tax of any citizen in the county. He was also the vice president of the DeKalb National Bank, the director of the Northwestern Railroad, and the owner of the DeKalb Rolling Mill. So he was a very successful and well-known individual in his county by the time he created his version of barbed wire. Glidden started working on his design for barbed wire in 1873. In it, Glidden placed the barbs along the wire and twisted another wire around it to keep the barbs in place, in a design he called the Winner, being his best design. He received a patent for this design in 1874 when he was 61 years old. He and a local hardware dealer named Isaac Elwood began manufacturing and selling the barbed wire with his patent as the Barb Fence Company in DeKalb, Illinois. In 1876, Glidden exited the manufacturing aspect, though he retained royalties by selling his half of the manufacturing business to a wire manufacturing plant in Massachusetts, from which Glidden and Elwood had been purchasing steel wire. The invention of his design made him extremely rich. It was estimated that Glidden earned $1 million in royalties until his patent expired in 1892. Companies manufacturing the barbed wire under his license ranged from New York to Kansas by 1884. By the time of his death in 1906, he was one of the richest men in America. So now that we've covered who Joseph Glidden is, how did the invention of barbed wire affect the cattle industry? For one, it raised the value of livestock. Before barbed wire, livestock oftentimes either wandered away or got stolen. The wandering was especially a problem. When cattle wandered, they faced the harsh climates of the plains without the environmental protection of the ranch. Not only that, but it made feeding the cattle extremely difficult, especially in the wintertime, when it was essential. Overall, this degraded the quality of the cattle, ensuring that the only breed used was the Longhorn, who could stand up to these conditions. The practice of branding used to combat wandering also decreased the value of livestock by at least $2 per animal. The long cattle drives were even more brutal on their condition. With long, weary distances and bad weather and environment, the cattle were more often than not tired, sapped of their fat, underfed, and damaged by the time they reached an auction house. Barbed wire eliminated these detriments by allowing ranchers to breed cattle near auction houses and railroads. The shorter cattle drives and the ability to contain them allowed ranchers to breed fat and well-fed cattle that were in good condition. This, overall, was a massive economic boon for ranchers. The elimination of wandering cattle also meant the protection of crops from grazing. Before, ranchers and farmers couldn't grow anything in the plains due to wandering cattle grazing on them, meaning that they had to stick to low-value crops like hay that were resistant to cattle-induced damage. After gaining the ability to keep cattle contained within a limited area, growing higher value crops such as wheat, barley, oats, and corn was now a possibility. This drastically raised the incentive for land settlement and increased the value of farmland within the American plains by nearly 50%. However, with the lands of the plains now occupied by barbed wire, open field cattle drives were no longer possible. This, of course, was a boon for ranchers, as I said earlier, but a bane for cattlemen. Their source of income came from driving cattle across long distances, and with the invention of barbed wire came the death of such profession. They fought back against this, at first claiming that barbed wire was terrible to livestock and the environment, but the cattle soon adapted and learned to respect the dangerous wiring. Still, cattlemen, feeling increasingly threatened and inconvenienced, began cutting illegal fencing. This, of course, escalated further into the emergence of fence-cutting gangs, who began cutting down lawfully placed fences as well, leading to a collection of conflicts called the fence-cutting wars, with landowners fighting back, oftentimes violently. This was evidenced in the very first primary document I discussed. And as seen there, this fence-cutting issue, further escalated into a political one and resulted in drastic legislation being drawn up to combat against these fence cutters. So how did barbed wire affect the cattle industry? By fundamentally shifting the way in which cattle were raised and sold, resulting in a transition from the era of open field to the era of private land ownership. Joseph Glidden's invention, the winner design, changed the Midwest by providing it a proficient and affordable solution to the problems that open field grazing caused. Lastly, it shifted the job market involving the cattle industry away from the cowboy, or the cattleman, and placed the power in the market in the hands of private landowners. This is why history presents Glidden as the inventor of modern barbed wire, as his design was not the first, but it was the one which made the most impact on the industry and the world itself. I've been Jeff Jackson, and this was the entirety of my Ranch Digital project.